Greetings, fellow painters! Today we have a fun paint-up where I deviate a bit from the game art, but ultimately stay true to the God of 1,000 forms as found in H.P. Lovecraft lore. With this miniature, I'm going to exercise and compare two different techniques for painting the fire effects. The large flame of the head and OSL on the back will be painted entirely with a standard paintbrush, while the glowing chest embers will be completed with the assistance of an airbrush. This way, you the viewer can decide which approach best suits your painting style and use that one technique to paint all of these effects on your own miniatures. Welcome to Trehane Miniatures. Per usual, I'm beginning with a miniature completely primed in black. I want to start by covering the miniature in two basic foundational colors that I've chosen. For the wings and eviscerated squiggly bits, I'm choosing Dark Plum by Monument Hobbies as the darkest shadow layer. I'm using a large dry brush to get the model covered as quickly as possible, but I'm not using a dry brush technique. I have the brush fully loaded with paint and I'm getting it into all of the recesses. I feel that this color will work equally well as the shadow color for the fleshy light purple color of the wings and for the deep red color of Nyarlathotep's slithering underbelly. For the body of Nyarlathotep, I'm using blue-black for the base coat. Once again, I'm using a large dry brush to get the paint on the model quickly. This time, however, I'm not looking to necessarily get the paint into every nook and cranny. The crevices in the body are relatively deep, so a little black primer way out of the way will make a fine extreme shadow color for this very dark blue paint. The plan is for the body to remain fairly dark with minimal highlighting for the finished product. Now, focusing first on the wings, I mix some basic skin tone by Vallejo into the dark plum in order to start working towards a more fleshy color for these dilapidated wings. I've downsized to a smaller dry brush, and I'm now using a heavy dry brush technique. I remove just enough paint from the brush so that it won't fall into the cracks and crevices in the wings, but still nicely covers all of the raised surfaces that I'm applying it to. I think that some people refer to this as wet brush technique, but to me that just sounds like another way to say that you're painting. I'm basically hitting all of the surfaces of the wing, except I'm mostly avoiding the sweeping curve that's found at the lower third of each wing. I imagine that less light would be affecting this part of the wing, so I'm treating it accordingly. I continue to work towards more of a flesh tone for the wings by adding more basic skin tone to the existing purple mix. I use the same dry brush as before, but with a lighter touch, and I'm covering less area. I'm painting within the boundary of the first dry brush layer and focusing the lighter paint toward the top of the wings. I further lighten the mixture with a little more basic skin tone and repeat the process one more time, covering a little less area on the model. Once I'm satisfied that I've lightened things up enough, I switch to a size 1 standard brush to intensify these highlights. I'm able to deliberately place more detailed highlights this way, and it allows me to reach the interior edges of all those gaping holes in the wings. The final highlight for the wings is applied with pure basic skin tone. These highlights are applied very sparingly to accentuate a few key areas of the wings. I want to add some brightness to the wings without completely killing the purple hue of this creature's flesh. Once I wrap up the rest of the model, I will come back to the wings with some blue-black paint to darken the wingtips and glaze some dark color over the wing fingers and veining. I'm going to begin our little fire effect comparison by starting with the heat vents in the torso. For this, I will be using an airbrush for the initial area effect. If the airbrush is something that just does not interest you, I do have exactly one timestamp in this video that will take you directly to creating the flame effect and OSL with a standard paintbrush. First, I whip up an acrylic pin wash with some titanium white acrylic ink and some flow improver. I paint this into all of the crevices to represent the hottest and brightest point of the emanating light. Then, I add this same white ink concoction to my airbrush to create a soft glow around this intense light source. I was honestly a little nervous about using an airbrush for this, as I have never attempted any real detailed airbrush work before. I have previously just used it for zenithal type layering, whether it's been for the base of OSL or an initial color layer for clothing or skin or the like. I wasn't sure that my cheapo airbrush that I got off Amazon for $16.99 would be up to the task. A few squirts in and I began to feel more at ease, which is usually the case. I have my compressor set to about 21 psi or 1.5 bars. The acrylic ink flows beautifully through the airbrush with just flow improver added to lube things up, and I easily achieve the effect that I'm after. For the second and final airbrush application, I run some clear orange paint through the brush. This requires much more thinning. I mix the paint and thinner in a separate pot before dumping it into the airbrush to make sure that I have the mixture thin enough. I always add a couple of drops of flow improver to the empty airbrush cup before introducing any paint to the brush. This helps keep things flowing smoothly. I'm spraying such a fine mist at such a low flow rate with this color that the paint occasionally binds in the brush, which I easily clear out by fully opening the flow and blasting it out onto a nearby cloth or the back of my hand. With the airbrush put away, I return one last time to the white ink and flow improver mix to recreate the brightest point of the glow. These highlights will be a little smaller and painted inside the previous white bright spots. Before committing the final glaze of paint to these bright highlights, I use some burnt red and a dry brush to darken the outer edge of the glowing region. This will darken the perimeter of the orange glow and work as a nice transition from the bright orange recesses to the darker flesh of the torso. The dark red should fade out into the dark blue skin color. I want to do this before finishing the brightest point of light just in case I screw up and hit the focal point of the light with this dark red. I guess I could have done this before I painted the white center in the first place. Live and learn. And now we're going to finish off that glow by painting over the titanium white and some of the surrounding orange layer with processed yellow acrylic ink. This is a translucent acrylic ink, so it has no trouble allowing the brightness of the white to shine through. And now onto the fire noggin. We'll use standard paintbrush methods for this entire feature. I'm starting by using burnt red pro acryl to dry brush the foundation for the OSL on the top ridge of the back. I like to begin with sloppy techniques such as dry brushing early in the process so that I don't accidentally screw up any of the fully painted areas later on in the painting. I'll work on the actual flame after I get this dry brushing out of the way. I use a standard size 1 brush to touch up some of the edges and intensify the red before calling it good. I use a mix of Liquitex acrylic white paint and acrylic white ink to establish a completely white base for the flames. It takes 3 or 4 coats to achieve a completely opaque layer of white over the black. This is why the continuity of the painting may seem a bit off in parts of this video. In between coats I would work on some other part of the Mini, such as the wings or the body. I'll edit this so that it makes sense as I complete work on one feature of the model before moving on to the next. In between coats of white, I return to the OSL on the ridge of the back with some clear orange to add to the bounce light effect. I draw these strokes toward the light source as best I can since the flame is directly overhead. I'm focusing on the part of each scale that is directly facing the flame, and I'm allowing it to naturally drop off into the established darker red color. For the final bounce light, I add some ice yellow to the clear orange and paint it just to the areas that would reflect the most light, like the upward facing ridge and edges. This is where it gets fun. We're painting the large flame with a standard brush using some wet blending. I'm simultaneously setting up pots of red ink, clear orange paint, and yellow ink. To each of these, I'm adding a little flow improver to help slow the dry time. I'm slathering these colors on the model fast and loose. I'm taking the yellow far beyond the point that will look yellow in the final product. This is because I'm going to immediately come in with the clear orange and wet blend it with the yellow. Following the same pattern, I draw the orange almost all the way up to the tip of the flames before grabbing some crimson red ink and working it into the orange, as well as most of the surrounding flame tips. Now, for the orange, I wasn't completely happy with how the clear orange was presenting on the model. It appears a little too dull and perhaps a little too dark for me. So off camera, I added a few drops of Daler Rowney fluorescent orange ink to the clear orange paint to liven things up a bit. Normally I'd video this step, but I am in a race against time. I live in an area that routinely has single-digit relative humidity levels, so even with the added flow improver, I'm struggling to get the wet paints blended together before they begin to dry. The red I'm working with is a translucent red ink, so initially I'm just concerned with blending it into the orange. I'll come back later and add additional layers to the tips of the flames where I think they require a little more opacity. Likewise, I'm not bothering with painting the yellow all over the lower part of the head. That will get accomplished after the initial wet blending is done. Once these initial 3 colors are blended together, I go back to refine the individual flames. The outer points of each flame should be darker than the interior of the flame. I use orange to edge highlight the yellow flames on the lower part of the model. I also use the fluorescent orange to glaze some orange over the outer edge of the head. I even paint some into the recesses within the red flames. I use the red ink to edge highlight some of the raised orange flames, and I intensify the red on the outer flame tips. The interior of the head is painted with some blue-black dots similar to how the game art looks. I chose to make the head the hottest point of the flame rather than making it look like an object that was on fire. Looking at the finished product, maybe it would have been more appealing to paint the front of the head as a solid object to increase the contrast in the piece. The final touch for the monstrous torch is to use some undiluted Agrax Earthshade to darken the very tips of the red flames. For the ungodly pile of spaghetti on the ground, I go over the existing dark plum with a heavy dry brushing of burnt red. I want to cover most of the dark plum, but I don't want the burnt red to seep into the recesses. Once this is done, I add a small amount of basic skin tone to the burnt red to create an initial highlight that runs along the bulbous part of each noodle. This is a small jump in color value. Then I take some pure basic skin tone to add a glint of light to the center of these initial highlights. This is a greater jump in color value that should help make it look like the tentacles are moist and shiny. The final step in this entire painting process is to return once again to our blue-black paint and touch up the wings and torso. On the wings, I first used the blue-black in a layer consistency to darken the wingtips and main arms of the wings. Next, I thin the paint about 50-50 with water to create a glaze that I use to establish a smooth transition between the purple color of the wing flesh and the dark blue of the wing talons. I also use it to darken some of the veining or creases in the wing skin. This all works to establish some irregularities in the overall appearance of the wings and make them look more natural. Or as natural as monster wings can look anyway. I use a mix of blue-black and white-blue to quickly wrap up Nyarlathotep's torso with a simple dry brush. Notice that this dry brush was done after establishing the red OSL area on the upper back, but before I finished painting the flame. This made sense as I was waiting for the white paint of the flame to dry, but I have rearranged the order of the video for continuity's sake. So we've still got a ton of miniatures to paint up for Cthulhu Death May Die. What do you think? Should I continue to take creative license with the color schemes on these minis, or should I stick closer to the game art? I'd love to hear your opinion. Thank you so much for watching this video tutorial on how to paint Nyarlathotep for Cthulhu Death May Die. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our growing community of painters.